Um, Oliver Mitchell, thank you for jumping on and joining us. Could you please start with just introducing yourself?
Sure, pleasure. Longtime founder, operator. I've built companies. I've sold them to big multinational organizations. And after my last startup, I started getting involved into the industrial robotics space, and I did that one of two ways. I started to back some really great founders under my own vehicle called Autonomy Ventures. Had a number of significant exits, including two IPOs and one unicorn buyout. And then I ended up joining my friends John Frankel and Alex Katz at FF Venture Capital. Really opened up deep tech. We're investors in Plus One, Civ Robotics, Cambrian Robotics, Managed Drone Delivery, and so many more. Today I'm at FF managing the portfolio that I'm responsible for, as well as I have Arkenstone Capital, where I spin out innovations coming out of the Israeli military, the elite units, and I scale them up here. Also advise a humanoid robotic startup called Persona AI that's focused on filling the labor gap in heavy industry with humanoids. And the first use case will be shipbuilding for Hyundai HD in welding. And so the second way I engage with the ecosystem is I write a lot of articles, and I'm an author of a book called A Startup Field Guide in the Age of Robots and AI, and how to take your idea from napkin drawing all the way to IPO.
Yeah, and really appreciate that intro. And you are actually a first-time author, so tell us a bit more about the book. That's something our audience would really benefit from what I've seen of it.
Absolutely. So I'm an avid hiker, and before you go out into the backcountry, you open up a field guide to know what to pack, what will be the weather conditions, how much rations you need based upon the trek. You look at the maps, you survey, the terrain. And I find that so many founders go out there and they're flying by the seat of their pants, and that they're really, figuring it out by PowerPoint bullets on a slide, and versus going and really learning from some of the brightest minds out there. And so I set out to create a field guide for startups within robotics and AI. I found that I work a lot in deep tech, and there's really nothing speaking to them. I'm a big fan, and I teach. I'm a adjunct professor at the SciSim School of Business, and I teach a startup owner's manual by Steve Blank, but it doesn't really deal with physical AI. And so I felt like there was something needed in the space, and I started to interview people. I made about 30 interviews, and really how to take your idea really from that kernel stage and get into customer discovery, to raising that initial bit of capital, to scaling up, to hopefully a positive liquidity event.
I appreciate the answer. And kind of want to jump into more of your venture activities. Now, I could ask you about FF, I could ask you about Arkenstone. We'll start with FF. I mean, we'll take it from there. So tell me, tell us, for the viewers, for founders who may not know about FF, could you give us like a quick overview of what you focus on, the type of companies you guys back, the stage and check sizes you typically invest at as well?
Absolutely. FF has been around since 2008. We focus on the early stage. We're typically the first institutional check for founders. They'll typically, bootstrap their company or raise from friends and family. And now they've gotten a little bit of market traction, some signaling from the market that there's something here. And they're going out and to raise that initial seed round. And they'll come to a firm like FF. We are generalist investors, but I myself focus on deep tech. So that's drones, robotics, AI, around both the enterprise and infrastructure. And so we have lots of great companies within the portfolio. Some of them have been around for a long time, and they're unicorns like Socure and Rescale, and some are just starting out.
Yeah, and to dive more into your kind of focus in deep tech, please tell us about Arkenstone Capital. We know you're a co-founder there, so would love to hear essentially the same questions there. Yeah.
Arkenstone is very unique. If you look at some of the highest performing companies coming out of Israel, and in general, some of the highest performing companies within the defense tech and cyberspace, they tend to come out of the elite units in Israel. And so that's like Unit 8200, Shimon Matayim, the Shabak, which is like Israel's FBI, the Mossad, like Israel's CIA, there's Sarmagal, there's so many, Shiket 13, there's so many great units, and they produce great founders, and they produce great teams who are literally battle tested, and they're working with some of the most advanced technologies. And now they finish their service, maybe they're leaving as a commander, an officer, and they're going out with that team, and they're looking to establish a startup based upon the technology that they're using. And they're very highly sought after by VCs on the ground in Israel. Israel's, not an emerging market. It's on par with Silicon Valley, with the East Coast here in New York and Boston, and it has a pretty good venture capital market. And so I have, partners and scouts on the ground in Israel out of those elite units that are sourcing great founders, and we're backing them. And then we try to help them as they scale up here within the enterprise, within the defense industry, and help build a cap table for longevity.
Sure. Essentially, you have a wealth of experience, especially within deep tech, and what you're doing right now, very active on the forefront of making sure that the right companies and the right founders are getting funded. Now, and you can answer this in any perspective. In fact, you could take it from whichever entity you think is more applicable to the following questions. So, what do you think separates founders who actually successfully raise capital from those who struggle to get investor traction? And again, you can answer this from a FF perspective or from an Arkenstone perspective, whatever you think.
I mean, I speak about it a lot in the book, and I think, I think there's a few factors. I don't think there's one. I think one is, at the early stage, you're investing in people. And so you want a founder and a team that can inspire a vision. And so it's people, product, and plan. And so you really want a team that's going to attract great talent, that inspires vision, and that they're really building a billion-dollar business. Today, a multi-billion-dollar business. I mean, just last week, Jensen said that NVIDIA is going to do $1 trillion worth of GPUs next year. That's insane. And so, the goalpost keeps getting further out in that regard. So you want someone with a big vision, and you really want an experienced team that knows how to execute that vision. Then you want a product that's extremely well differentiated in the marketplace. I personally want a product, that I can call up on customers. So how do you do that in an early stage? Well, maybe they've done some proof of concept or a pilot, and they're just like at the cusp of commercialization. They've gotten some a little initial revenue, just to really as proof of concept, and now they need investment to take it to the next level. And so that's something that's really important to me is customers. So much of people that go out and AI companies, robotics companies, they get attracted to the technology, but they don't know what problem they're solving, and they don't speak to enough customers to figure out their go-to-market. So I really want people that have figured that out already, and then really a plan to really get them to be, a scalable business out there, to grow to being a 100 million ARR within a 36 60-month time period. And so, when Mick Mounts, for example, the founder of Kiva Systems, set out to found Kiva, like I discussed in my book, he didn't set out, to say, I want to build a robotics company. He knew the space of online fulfillment. And he said, I need, there's something broken here. And so he created a robot that brought the shelving to the picker. That business ended up serving the top 10% of all e-commerce companies, and eventually got bought by Amazon for $775 million in 2012. That's still a big exit in the robotics market. Now we're entering the age where now we are having so many, unicorns within the humanoid and robotics market that the next level of liquidity events are going to pale in comparison. But it was an amazing outcome in 2012. And so I want someone who's really figured out that go-to-market. And if they haven't got there yet, they need to show me the path.
Okay. And on that note as well, in terms of talking about companies and what makes them valuable, what factors matter most to you when you're determining a company's value?
I mean, I think I think it goes back down to customers, customers, customers. It's just like to me that the valuation has to be, based upon a multiple of what those revenues will be. It can't just be based upon whole numbers. I like multiples of five, 15, 20, 25, 30, 45. It has to really be based upon, the multiple of the revenues. And there should be comparables there in that space to support that. Now, each market is very different. And as investors, we have to separate the signal from the noise. So with Israeli companies, this cyber market, we've had amazing exits of Wiz to Google and CyberArk to Palo Alto Networks. These were, 32 billion and 25 billion, respectively. And so the cyber market is more expensive than, to say, the defense tech market, which is actually growing really nicely, or the enterprise AI market. And so you have to look at, within that marketplace to see, where it makes sense based upon those comparables there.
Sure. Appreciate the answer there. And with your kind of insight and your knowledge, right? And I know your book would probably cover a lot of this, but your book won't be a live representation of your thoughts currently. I want to ask you, what major shifts are you seeing in venture capital right now that founders should understand?
Well, my book does cover it, Startup Field Guide in the Age of Robots and AI, and book sales are always appreciated. I think it's really important that founders, realize, first off, that capital partners are not a homogeneous, group, and that they really have to match, what they're looking for to the type of investor. And so FF's a generalist investor. There's Eclipse is more in the deep tech space. They might want more of that deep tech support. They're more of a high concentration fund that invests in multiple rounds, very expensive rounds. FF bows out after $50 million valuation. Eclipse is investing up until your company's worth $1 billion, and they might want that continuity of an investor there, and that might be a better fit. They might want, there's accelerators and there's incubators. They might want that level of support. There's corporate investors, and they might want that for, I have a company, Civ Robotics here. They have Trimble and they have Bobcat on their cap table, which helps them on R&D, helps them on supply chain, helps them on channel partner sales. And that might be really important. And so they have to figure out what is really important to find that matching first and foremost. I think there's a lot going on right now. As Jensen said, everything is AI now. Every company is an agentic company, and it's moving extremely quickly. I mean, ChatGPT got to 100 million users, within a day, and then, Claude Code is going so quickly that Anthropic doesn't even check its code anymore. Claude Code is doing it, and that's from the founder of Claude Code. And OpenClaw, it got to the level of Linux, on their orchestration platform within 3 weeks. That took Linux 15 years. And so we're moving very quickly. And so, you have to take that into account from the investment standpoint, that really you have to have your strategy really worked out. And it can't just be building on top of, the noise out there. It has to be grounded into actual, real nuts and bolts of who's doing it with you, and how are you going to win, and what are you using to win with. And I think if there are founders here who have not watched Jensen's keynote, from GDC last week, they should spend the 2.5 hours watching it. If anything, they'll learn how to present better. And number two is just how everything is thought through. And really, that's what a founder has to lay that path, and it's moving very quickly. And that's why the humanoid market is a very expensive market right now. That's why real agentic AI is very expensive right now because it's moving that quickly and investors are that excited to get involved with it. But if you're coming to me with a 15-year-old startup that is now just figuring out AI, it's really not going to be very exciting to me.
Okay. Appreciate the depth there. And founders want to know what would be exciting to a partner and a co-founder like yourself. So let me ask this then. When the founder does reach out to you, what makes you actually respond and take that first meeting?
Well, I'm usually pretty good at just responding in general. I try to be nice. I would say that it really has to match me. If someone's coming to me, like, for example, for a new therapeutics to treat diabetes, they've not taken the time to realize that I don't invest in that. I deal with robotics and it's deep tech, and they really have to distinguish themselves based upon everything out there. They have to recognize that I have a little bit of knowledge, and they have to, really distinguish themselves, why it's different than X, Y, and Z out there. And then I think what's the best way to distinguish themselves is how people are using them, and so if they're coming to me and saying, I'm thinking about doing this and I want to do that, that's not that exciting, because I'm like, well, come back to me when you've thought it through, because I want to see where it's going to go before I'm going to risk capital. As a VC, our first and foremost job is to manage money, is wealth appreciation. And so whether that's for individual, a family office, for institution, it's the same. And so my job is managing risk and deploying capital and mitigating risk. So, and I have lots of products that I can invest in, but I'm going to invest in one where I think it's the biggest opportunity, the biggest payback, and the least amount of risk. And so they have to recognize that, when thinking about that. And then, sometimes people say, I read your book, and they'll quote something from the book, and that's always a good way to get my attention.
That's good to know. Good to know then. And then on that basis, and you can't use the answer not reading your book. What are the three biggest mistakes founders make when raising capital that you've seen?
Here, I'm going to, let me go back here. If any founder wants to buy my book, here's the Amazon link. So I think, the three biggest mistakes is, first one is arrogance, is not listening, and just, continuing to present, being argumentative and being defensive and not listening to feedback. Now, I might not be the greatest expert out there, and I'm not, but you came to me for my advice, for my capital. And so I think if I have a suggestion, you should respond to it in an intelligent way, and acknowledge it, and if someone becomes argumentative, and that is really a turnoff, and I just don't want to spend time with that person. So it's surprising how many people come off like that, and it just become very arrogant and so forth like that. There are people that, they might think it's cool. They might think like, I'm going to be Elon Musk, but there's only one Elon Musk out there, right? There was only one Steve Jobs. I want to invest in a founder who I want to spend time with, who's going to be coachable and flexible and listen. So that's turn off number one. Number two is, I think, I don't really love when people come to me and they lie. That's also a really big turnoff. And I'm pretty good at catching people in their lie. And so like they might say, we have this and we have that, and I'm like, well, how many people are in the team? Well, I got this and this. I was like, how many people are full time? Well, it's just me. I'm like, okay, why did you misrepresent yourself? Why were you so disingenuous there? And so like, it's really important. Once again, my job is to mitigate risk. And so like, it's really important to be as open and as upfront. And I might say, listen, I don't really love single founders. I like to invest in teams and partners, and I might say, you should speak to so and so. They're looking for a co-founder there, and so forth like that. But if people are disingenuous, if they overstate revenue, if they, a lot of times people might, it's very funny. What's happened lately is that people will say, "Oh, well, we have AR of like 40 million." I'm like, okay. So how much money top line was last year? Oh, it was about 100,000. I'm like, okay, like that's disingenuous. You just can't be taking like what a potential contract can be and calling it AAR. So that's number two. And I think, number three is just not, really doing your homework and really thinking it through and really having a sync plan and just, having something that is, um, half baked, because you were just going out too early and you've not really taken the time to really think it through. With customer discovery, I say you should speak to at least 500 potential customers and really find out who the ultimate decision maker is. And I want to dig into that. I'm personally someone who doesn't really like PowerPoint. And I prefer to have a discussion when someone send me the PowerPoint, send me the business plan beforehand. I'll read it, and then I like to have a discussion. And so I don't like to be presented to. But and I say that is that often when you have a discussion, you can really get to the nuts and bolts. It's beyond the presentation, which is very surface layer. And I think people have to really think it through, and also maybe do a soft presentation to friendly audiences before going to professional investors first.
Sure. Okay. Really appreciate the depth you went into with those mistakes there and those answers. Um, I really appreciate that. Now we have a segment at the end called "Please Stop, Please Start." Essentially, here I want you to tell me something you want startup founders to please stop doing, and something you want them to please start doing. And it can be in regards to anything: valuation, due diligence, outreach, and the two answers do not have to be related. So please give us your please stop.
Um, I think please stop reading off of slides and really, master, the presentation, the pitch, and the business. I always say, I teach about business plans at the university, an MBA course, and I think a business plan is as much for the founder as it is for the intended audience. Once you've written, a 30-page business plan, you understand all the intricacies of your business. If you're just doing a 10-page slide deck, you just have some, surface layer PowerPoints. And know your numbers. I don't know how many times I've asked revenues, cost of goods, terms, and they just don't know. They say, "Oh, I gotta let me," they should just know that. They should live and breathe the business.
Sure. Okay. Okay, that's good. Please stop. And please start.
I guess I ended with the please start knowing your numbers.
Oh,
Yeah,
perfect.
yeah.
So that's the please stop and that's the please start. Okay, perfect.
I think, no, please start getting out of the building. I quote Steve Blank on that one. It's just like too many founders will be in their WeWork space. They'll be talking about, say a robotics company that's going to a distribution center. I'll be like, how many distribution centers have you visited? Why aren't you going out? You should be going and meeting with potential customers. Once again, those customer discovery, you should be living and breathing it. Andrea Thomas, when she launched Diligent Robotics, they lived in Cedars-Sinai, literally slept on their bed, living in Cedars-Sinai for 6 months before they launched the Moxie robot. You should be living and breathing your customer's pain.
Yes. Oliver, you've been absolutely amazing. Do you have any final closing thoughts before we kind of wrap it up?
I mean, just keep that passion, because that's what's attractive is being passionate about an idea and taking everybody with you on the journey.
Really appreciate your time. Really appreciate your thoughts and your perspective and the knowledge you've been able to slap us with, and really appreciate the book as well.
Buy the book, A Startup Field Guide in the Age of Robots and AI.
It will be linked below, everyone. So please, if you do get the chance, please take a look at it and definitely buy.
My pleasure.